Welcome to our second lecture on APA-style in-text citations. I hope you watched the first part of this because it's the foundation for what we're going to be talking about. When we cite uh, our references, we talked in the earlier lecture about the process we go about when we're citing quotes. I want to continue with that a couple of slides later, but I also want to talk about how we cite when we're not quoting directly. And it's pretty easy. Whenever we paraphrase something or we get an original idea or we get data or information, in other words, whenever we have anything in our paper that came either directly or indirectly from a source that we've been using, we still need to engage in citing that. But what we don't do is, we don't have to do is use the page number. The page number is only used when we quote exactly, word for word, what has been in a particular article. In terms of quoting rules, there's the 5-word rule. If you have 5 words in a row that are similar, or the same, I should say, to the source you're using, you have to use quote marks. If it's more than 5 words. If it's under 5 words, what we do is, of course, we call that paraphrasing. What you're seeking to do when you're paraphrasing is convey what the author or authors were trying to put forward, but you're not using their exact words. And again, as long as you keep it less than 5, that's just fine. Again, a few other things about quoting. Whenever we quote directly, you want to avoid certain kinds of quoting. First of all, can I say this as a general rule? In a lit review paper, you want to the greatest extent you can, avoid quoting directly from your sources. A literature review paper is you, as the author of your paper, summarizing the various journal articles and obviously integrating them with each other and reporting on what the field says about this, that, or the other thing. And in terms of this, that, or the other thing, it's your paper, so you want to avoid quotes. The operational rule here, well, my operational rule is I don't like to see any quotes, quite frankly, with 2 exceptions. The first exception is this, that the quote that you choose to use is so perfectly and well stated, eloquently stated, that there's no possible way for you to state it better. That would be the first rule. The second rule would be to use direct quotes when you're quoting either a famous statement or an infamous statement. In other words, in a lit review paper, when you're quoting, when you're writing about Freud and there's a famous Freud quote, you would put that in quotes. All other uses of quotes I would encourage you to avoid. Strive to read the article and then paraphrase it if you have to, or put it in your own words. Also avoid quoting parts of sentences because it's too easy to take that out of context. And that, of course, leads to be in front of you, taking information out of context. And again, this applies to paraphrasing. You also want to avoid quoting, for instance, when your article has quoted somebody else, you want to avoid quotes of quotes. That gets complicated, and it's very, very difficult to say in those particular instances to know who is saying what. Is it the original quote, or is it the author quoting them, and now you're quoting the author who's quoting them? So I would encourage you to avoid that. Having said that, the general rule for a 7 to 12 page paper is that you absolutely should never have more than 3 direct quotes in a paper that long. And so I think if you follow that rule, not just in the paper that you're writing for me this semester, but in any of your classes, you would be advised, you'd be well served by that rule. Now, let me just pause here before we go back to the technical aspect of in-text citations and ask the question, why are there so many different ways to quote? Um, uh, why, for instance, sometimes would you want to begin with the author's name? Why sometimes you would want to have a paragraph that said researchers have found. And the reason for that is if you use the same quotation technique every single time, it gets kind of tedious and it gets kind of boring. So you want to mix it up a little bit. You want to use different styles. Good writing keeps the reader engaged, and part of good writing is to not use the exact same way of saying things. So, for instance, if you were writing and you said that the following three um, issues were brought up by Robert Sternberg. And then again, you might want to say the first one would be, and then you might want to say the second one would be, and then instead of saying the third one, you maybe see finally, or the final one would be. Again, mixing it up sometimes is a way of engaging the reader, showing your versatility, and again, um, having a different particular kind of focus to your paragraphs. And let me just mention three ways that you might want to organize your information and therefore organize the way you're going to um, um, cite in text. The first one is what we could call idea focused. And in idea focused, you're not really concerned about the author or the dates. Rather, you're focusing upon the idea involved and discussing the idea. And then in this particular situation, you would put the author and year at the end because your focus here is the idea, not the author. So researchers have studied how children represent mathematical problems. In other words, that's the idea. And in this particular example, you can see we have three different articles, excuse me, two different articles cited, and you will notice that they are alphabetically cited. So idea-focused ways often are going to use the parenthetic method of citation. In other words, the author and year are going to be at the end of the paragraph or at the end of the sentence. The opposite of that would be researcher-focused, in which you want to begin your paragraph or sentence focusing on the researchers who did this research. And there may be good reasons for that because, for instance, if you're comparing and contrasting two research approaches or two theories, it would be important for the people reading your article to know which of these you're doing. And so you're going to constantly be focusing upon these researchers said this. On the other hand, Fred, Smith, and Jones found this. So in this particular case, when you want to emphasize the researchers, you want to use their names followed by, again, the year. And again, if you're doing a direct quote for what they asked, particularly quoting their strategies, that would be followed at the end of the quote by the particular page number. Again, this is often used doing literature reviews because we're focusing upon the researchers particularly, not necessarily the ideas. Finally, the third way would be chronology focused. If you're doing a literature review in which you're trying to, for instance, your literature review would be upon the historical treatments of treating schizophrenia. And probably in that particular instance, you are going to start at the beginning, I would assume, and trace the treatment of schizophrenia through the decades or through the years. So in that particular case, you would focus upon the year. Okay, so instead of beginning your paragraph with the author or the idea, you want to emphasize the year. In 2009, blah, 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 blah. And then again, a paragraph or two later, you may say a decade later, in 2019, the authors Jones, Fred, and Smith found this. So keep that in mind when you start to write your research paper. Do you want to, in this paragraph or the first two paragraphs, focus upon the general ideas that you're trying to get across? Or do you want to focus upon, contrasting theories or approaches? And so you're looking at the authors, or is there a chronology, a logical chronology to your lit review that's going to set up a kind of introduction to your paragraphs, focusing on the year? I hope that's helpful as I've elaborated that. Now, going back to technical uses here, um, when you do find, for instance, information that is cited by the author that you're reading, that they got from somebody else, we call this secondary source citation. So I suspect as you look at your journal articles, uh, there are huge places in the introduction and the discussion in those journal articles in which um, the authors of those journal articles are citing other people. And as you read those, you may think it's important to cite those other people. Now, if possible, you maybe not for this paper, but when you go on to write papers for your upper level classes and even graduate classes, if it's possible, you should look in the references and actually find that article and where it is, and then cite that directly. Um, but if you are just doing this small a paper like this, you have to have a way to cite it. Again, when you do this, you cite both of them in the text, and I'll show you how to do that in a second. But since you didn't look up the original article, you're only citing the secondary source in your references. So this is the way you could do it. Let's say you're paraphrasing, and your author, the author of the journal article that you're looking at, is Brophy 2003. But as you're reading Brophy 2003, Brophy has cited this author named Thonis. And so this is how it would go. Thonis emphasizes that creating an ethical solution requires participation in all parties. Now, what you're going to do in terms of your in-text citation is you're going to put as cited in Brophy, okay? Because you already mentioned Thonis. Now, if you don't write Thonis's name, you will, in your citation, put Thonis in your parenthetical citation. Let's say you said a researcher emphasized that creating an ethical solution requires participation by all parties. So you would put in your parenthetical citation Thonis as cited in Brophy, 2003. For a direct quotation, again, Thonis remarks, quote, writing center literature, blah, 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 end quote. And now you have to give the page number, not in Thonis because you haven't looked Thonis up, but in Brophy, as cited in Brophy, 2003, page 170. And then again, if Thonis' name is not in the quotation, a prominent researcher in the past remarked, writing center literature, blah, 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 you would put in your parenthetical quote, you would put Thonis as cited in Brophy, again, so on and so forth. So perhaps you'll use this in your paper. Most lit review papers do. So be aware that it's a little bit different than those other citations. And if I could warn you, please don't just go to Brophy, find out the year Thonis said that, and directly quote Thonis unless you have gone and looked up the original. So when you're writing your sentences and paragraphs, one of the things you want to keep in mind is to cite the source as soon as you can, certainly at the end of each paragraph. Many times at the end of a couple of sentences, particularly if all those sentences relate to one author. What you don't want to do is put the same citation after every single sentence. Again, as long as the content coming after or before a particular citation is the same, you can cite once instead of citing 5 times if there's 5 sentences. Now, this would change if you're citing several different authors or several different journal articles within a paragraph and you're interspersing them, and I highly recommend that. Then in that particular case, what you want to do is have a citation after each unique sentence before you go along to another citation from another author. So clearly the citation possibilities here are endless, and I know you're probably. Again, another thing to remember is that if you do cite an author in text with the date beginning with the paragraph, later citations in the same paragraph, all you need to do is cite the name, not the year. Try and remember that this is just a means to unclutter and simplify paragraphs that all are about one particular individual. And so the first citation in a paragraph is 1 year, involves the year, and the others do not have to have that. You have to remember that even if you have 2 or 3 paragraphs that are dealing with the same article, there has to be a citation at the end, or depending on how you're using this, in each paragraph. You don't want to have paragraphs in terms of your argumentation that have no citations at all, because essentially what we're assuming is that everything in the paragraph is attributable not to anybody in particular, no resource other than you, if there's no citation there. And one last reminder here before we have a couple more slides. Don't ever change the order of authors' names in your citations. Those name orders are there for good reason. They're very rarely alphabetized. The first author is always what's considered the primary author. This is the author that's had the most input into this article, perhaps the lead researcher. So don't think that you need to put the authors' names in alphabetical order. Keep them in the exact order that they are in your journal article. This can be a little confusing, clearly, because when you're citing 2 or 3 or 4 different journal articles parenthetically, you do put those alphabetically, and of course it's alphabetically by the first author's last name. So do not alphabetize authors within a journal article. If you're citing more than one journal article, you're citing those alphabetically, but of course alphabetically according to the last name. One last thing to remember, and then we'll be done, and congratulations, you made it through these 2 lectures, is when you are quoting directly, there's a rule about how to quote. So any quote that's less than 40 years is done using quote marks, and it's included in the narrative, and then the citation is given parenthetically, or at least the page number is always given parenthetically. So in a short quote, the end punctuation follows the parenthetic citation. So here would be an example of this. Assessment practices need improvement. Hummel and Wheat, 1994. Again, we're starting with the authors, state that, quote, over 80% of the test items examined did not require critical thinking. And again, close quote, page 4. Or if you're using parenthetical quotes, you can see in the bottom, it's simply, at the very end of the quote, we simply have Hummel and Wheat, 1994, page 4. And we've seen examples of this already. Where we have the exception is what we call long quotes. This would be quotes that are more than 40 words. And yes, you need to count the number of words. From all the way up to 40, you put the quote in the narrative. 41 and over, you use the following method to include your quote. You do not use quotation marks. Instead, what you do is you indent 5 spaces, your entire quote, and follow it at the end by a page number. So Hummel et al. 1994, if you're starting with the author's name, you would put the page number. But if you said an important research study found that expected criticisms on how they use the term reinforcer, and then you have the quote. And again, instead of having just page 5 there, you'd have Hummel et al., comma, 1994, comma, page 5. Hopefully you won't have a quote longer than 40 words for this paper. It better be really, really good reasons for that. But there are very good reasons in some of your other papers for your other classes where you will have long quotes. It'll be necessary to have long quotes, um, um, particularly papers that are not literature review, and so it's good for you to remember this. Thank you for listening, and we will see you on the next lecture.